Hi, this is the presentation for Module 5. It's on multicultural education. So I like this graphic because it shows the multidimensionality to multicultural education. It's not just about different cultures. It's not just about um, a collection of stories about or for different cultural groups. You might encounter a course like that in cultural studies, where you might have a chapter on Asian cultures, African cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, South American cultures, or even more individual cultures within any of those continents or groups. You might have a cultural studies class that involves studies of Native American groups. You might have ethnic studies that has to do with African Americans or Africans in the diaspora, African people all over the world, or in particular Asian American, or what's another one? Brazilian Japanese. But multicultural education could include that, different cultures, certainly, but also different aspects of our social world that could be constituted as a culture. So, for example, we have religion, we have sexual orientation, we have disability. Not usually thought of as cultures, but they have their own histories, languages, um, rules, norms, um, uh, entrance and exit requirements for group membership, um, boundaries. So they function like cultures when we're looking at groups sociologically. We also have gender and age, and race and ethnicity, and then socioeconomic status as well. So it's a study of multiple intersectional groups and group identity and the way that group membership impacts our lives. And when we're talking about multicultural education, we're talking about an education that is attempting to include people from all of these different membership groups. And of course, any one particular person is going to have membership in multiple groups, perhaps all of these groups. All of these groups. So there is a national organization for multicultural education. It's NAME, the National Association of Multicultural Education, and these are their principles. And if you're downloading the PowerPoints, you'll find some hyperlinks in this presentation, just like all of them. And here you can follow the hyperlink to the website and explore a little bit more about the resources and the activities and the action items, the political positions that this organization takes around these principles. So to them, multicultural education involves developing positive academic identities for students who either historically haven't been identified as what we think of as scholars, or for people who are have been turned off by school. So there's this idea that school is a place for more affluent people, or a place for white people, or a place for people who speak English. or it used to be a place for men, and now it seems it feels more like a place for girls and women. And so we have to do what we can to make an academic identity a positive one for all of those people who feel like it doesn't fit with their identity. And we do this for the benefit that an education can bring. When we look at life outcomes, we see that people with more education tend to do better on not just income, but measures of health and happiness as well. Positive social identities, same thing. Respectful engagement with diverse groups. So here's that rejection of the idea that it's just the sum of the addition of all the groups together, but the idea that there should be engagement and exchange in between groups. A social justice consciousness. So we talked about taking a critical perspective here. So this organization is looking out for injustices and taking a position that there should be education that leads to more just arrangements. And then social justice actions. So these are the activities that educators, legislators engage in to actually change policy that will support a more just education system and society. So from James Banks' chapter, the first chapter of his book, the Handbook of Multicultural Education Research, and before that too, he provides a history of multicultural education, and I drew largely from that, but I also arranged this with some commentary that I think is useful for a general audience who doesn't have experience with multicultural education. So it's not something new, it's not something that just popped out of the last few decades, although our modern ideas, or our contemporary ideas, let's say, I won't use the term modern incorrectly. Our contemporary ideas about education, multicultural education, as a movement toward inclusion and equity did come from the 1980s, but it has this history in this country for much earlier. So you did have an ethnic studies movement, that idea of the groups are separate, but they also are working on education for themselves. So African Americans, even enslaved, were always finding ways to get education, to learn how to read, because this was forbidden to them. And they knew it was important. So they always worked on this. They always worked on education that helped them to retain their cultural knowledge, to their storehouse of skills, as a way to survive and as a way to keep their a strong identity for themselves, and a rejection of the identity of being just this collective group called slaves. Of course, the people that were brought here enslaved were from many different cultures and spoke many different languages. German immigrants wanted to retain German and wanted to teach their children German, so they established schools where they could do that, to retain their heritage and their separate language. And we might refer to these today as ethnic enclaves, this idea of a self-segregation or a standing apart for the purpose of cultural retention. So you might see groups in the Pacific Northwest, for example, where there are a large population of Asian Americans from a specific cultural group, say the Hmong Chinese. Maybe they want to retain some language and some history of their culture, and since they compose most of the population, you might see schools popping up that way as either private or charter schools. And in cases where people are establishing separate ethnic enclaves, we don't put that in the same category as segregation being an injustice. It's a choice. It's a self-selection. That doesn't mean that you can't bring arguments against that. There are practical arguments against that, but these are cases where people wanted to retain culture or language. So the exception here being African Americans who were forbidden from learning, from being educated, from reading, and were certainly kept apart. Then the World War II made Americans aware of how useful it would be to retain knowledge of the cultures and languages of Europe in particular for strategic reasons in the war. And this became apparent between World War I and World War II. But after World War II, where Europe needed to be more or less rebuilt, and the emergent superpowers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, were deciding which country would have control over which parts of the world. The idea was that what both the Soviets and folks in the US were doing was establishing markets in these new rebuilt economies. So there was a need to have language skills and culture skills in order to cooperate and to build multinational corporations and to continue trade. And then the ethnic studies movement of the 60s and 70s was about reclaiming identity and agitating for civil rights. So we think of African Americans, but we should also think of other traditionally marginalized groups as well. The gay civil rights movement, the disabilities civil rights movement, and the women's civil rights movement. And then, so our contemporary multicultural education might be inclusive of ethnic studies. So again, if you take a college course, you may take one in, say, Arab American studies. Cultural studies, we're going to be studying multiple groups, maybe a chapter at a time, or a period of focus on multiple groups. Cultural studies also recognizes intersectionality. So you might study Chicana lesbian poetry, something like that. So the intersection of groups has meaning and both complicates and enhances the cultural identity of the members of the multiple groups. And here we have women's studies, queer studies, and masculinity studies. I would put this under multicultural education as well, because from the last module, you learned about masculinity studies. And I would also include whiteness studies. So white is a construction. So some people say that, oh, well, it means Caucasian. But Caucasian people are in the Middle East too, as well. And we don't recognize them as white. And in North Africa as well. So whiteness studies is about remembering all of those ethnic groups that were melted into this creation called white, and how that was accomplished through differential power, what was lost, how people who identify as white now have lost their ethnic cultural histories. And then, so there might be stories of, coming to America stories. So the history of the Jews in America, the history of the Italians in America, the history of the Chinese in America. Of course, the Chinese are considered white, so that would be part of ethnic studies and not part of whiteness studies. So when we talk about multicultural education, one of the things that we have to talk about as a component of that, because it adopts social justice as a mission and criticality as a position, as an approach or a lens. This idea of identity privilege. So within all of the social status categories, and I have some of the most obvious ones here, there's always going to be a position of dominance or a position of privilege. And so we refer to that in general as identity privilege. Any unearned benefit or advantage one receives in society by nature of their identity. It's conferred systematically. This doesn't have anything to do with anyone's individual histories or achievements or qualities. And the extent to which we have any certain privilege varies depending on our place in the other status categories. And this alone could explain why some lower income white people reject the idea of white privilege. If you've had a conversation with someone about white privilege and they say, I'm not privileged, I struggle every day, I've had to struggle my whole life, I don't have any kind of privilege, they are not recognizing their skin privilege. What is evident from a sociological study and a historical study and a statistical study is that poor or not, white skin privilege carries the several advantages, and we'll get to that in the next slide. But it's really hard to feel privileged when you are starving, when you are homeless, when you have an untreated disability, when you have been through the prison system. So how do you think of yourself as privileged? Well, this point is worth remembering, is that privilege varies. So not all white people are as privileged as other white people. So class definitely plays a role in enhancing race privilege, and as does heterosexuality, as does English language speaking, as does Christianity, as does American citizenship, as does being male. So all of these status positions determine how much privilege you're going to enjoy in any of the other status category positions. But race seems to be one of those things that makes people mad. People who don't enjoy privileges in other status categories, they don't like to hear about the one status category in which they do enjoy privilege. And enjoy privilege is also maybe a misleading term. What that just means is that you have the advantage of not being suspect. You have the advantage of being considered the norm or the average. You're just going to be doing better than other people in different racial categories if there's no complication by class. So class trumps race in some cases. In other cases, it does not. So we have Frances Kendall and Peggy McIntosh as two longtime educators, authors, speakers, and advocates for advocating for white people to get in touch with white privilege, to understand what that means. And they come at it through a personal reflection of the privileges that they've enjoyed. So you see the images and the histories of these folks. So Peggy McIntosh is most well known for her invisible knapsack. And so back in 1988, she started reflecting on the privileges she enjoyed as a white person, as at the time she was struggling with the discrimination against women and the omission of women's contributions and women's histories to college curriculum. And she was trying to understand her male colleagues and how they could disregard women's histories, accomplishments, interests as being something extra, as being something soft and fluffy, something unnecessary for the core curriculum. So in trying to understand that, she went through a period of self-reflection on her own race privilege and how she had herself and others like her had been thinking of non-white people as being extra or other or unnecessary for the core history of the country. So she, like Frances Kendall, recognizes white privilege as an institutional set of benefits. So again, it has nothing to do with any one particular person. Any one particular white person might have very, very little privilege as to negate any advantage of being white. But when we're talking about large scale statistics and outcomes, access to resources like housing and healthcare and education, experiences with the criminal justice system, that's when we really see the disparity there. And that's outside of individual actions of discrimination. Individual people can have racial prejudice and engage in racial discrimination, but we're talking about a systemic, institutional phenomenon that advantages white skin by making certain assumptions about them as being normal, as being better than, as being someone trustworthy. And the phenomenon comes from, it comes from our humanity, our inherent humanity, and our tendency to be drawn to people who look like us and who seem to be like us. There was evolutionary advantage in this, and studies with babies show that we're still born this way, that we prefer people who act like us and look like us. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to check in with ourselves about that when we are preferring people just because they look like us or sound like us or have our same experiences. That's complicated with a history of legal discrimination against certain groups of people, compounded with a secondary history of habits or customs or inherited beliefs about certain groups of people. So not only is there a natural bias, then there is socialized bias as well. And these are the things that we have to recognize growing up in the society that we did. We're going to have these socialized beliefs as well as our inherent natural biases. So it doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means that we have to be aware of that tendency in ourselves. So some of the privileges that are in Peggy McIntosh's backpack that she realizes for herself is that being white, she has the choice to be ignorant of the histories of non-white people and still be considered well-educated. When I started reading this work, this kind of blew my mind too. We English-speaking people can be considered well-educated, knowing just one language. And that's the power, that's the privilege of being a native English speaker. And there's no denying that. We can be considered U.S. citizens can be considered well educated even if they've never traveled outside of the U.S. Think about that. Think about that privilege. We can become experts in our field, whatever our field is, as long as it's not multicultural education or cultural studies. Never having studied the histories of peoples other than those included in the dominant groups of society. So we can be ignorant of women's history, of Chicano history in the U.S., of Mexican history outside the U.S., we can be ignorant of the different cultures on the continent of Africa and still be considered well educated. That's a privilege of being white. Complicated or compounded with the privilege of being a U.S. citizen, complicated or compounded with the privilege of being a Native American speaker. The advantage of being part of a racial group at the center of world history. Right? Also connected to Christianity, also connected to speaking English. So that, the history books that we read in this country show a trajectory from Europe, from Great Britain, into the Americas, and then follows the battles, the settlement, the actions, the elections, and ruling and warring histories of the dominant group. That's considered history. If we add to it the experiences of other groups, see, we're adding to it, we're thinking of other histories, whereas we tend to think of mainstream history as being the history of the descendants of the first wave of mostly English immigrants to North America. And that's partial. Like, by definition, that's partial. The ability to choose to see yourself as normal or typical. I've encountered students who say, I don't have an ethnicity, right? So that's part of whiteness studies, is recovering the ethnicity that's been lost as white people have transitioned from being Irish or Italian or Romanian or Swedish or German. They've transitioned away from that into America, and now they're white, and they might say that they are culturally American, but they've lost this history of ethnicity. The ability to be free from suspicion of wrongdoing or deficiency based on your race. The freedom not to be followed around in a store when you're shopping. The freedom to walk down the street in your neighborhood without being thought of as a criminal. These are important. These can be life-saving privileges, as we know from events that are still going on. The ability to count on your race as a financial asset. Unfortunately, we still have the phenomenon of privilege being assigned to white people who are applying for credit of any kind, who are shopping for homes. In any kind of financial arrangement, there's that assumption that, and it's hidden in some cases, right? I don't think that there are most people in finance set out to discriminate, but that's part of the inherent bias that we have to watch out for. But then how do you explain the resultant discrimination of people of color against other people of color? That's socialized bias to see dark skin as being deficient or something wrong with. And then the ability to speak up about racism if you want to, without being seen as self-serving or radical. So white women realized in their struggle for equal rights that they had to do their part to stand up for other groups who were being discriminated against, because when you speak out about discrimination of your own group, some people receive that as being too loud, too radical, unsatisfied, ungrateful, abnormally preoccupied, and biased, right? You can't see reality because you are a member of that group. So that means that those of us who have privilege in one category have the freedom to talk about discrimination and wrongdoing against people of another category, and we can be seen as more objective than they can. It's not fair, but it's the way things work sociologically. So here's Frances Kendall. Not very different from Peggy McIntosh. She is the person who wrote the book on white privilege, Understanding White Privilege, from Routledge, and there it is there. Both her and Peggy McIntosh are still consultants for organizations who want to recognize white privilege and do something about that. So some additional things that Frances Kendall observed that maybe Peggy McIntosh didn't. If you're white, you're born with privilege that you didn't ask for and you can't give away. And this is really useful when you're talking about white privilege among white people whose first reactions tend to be either guilt or self-defense, right? Defensiveness. If you're working with defensiveness, what you should do is go to those other categories where people feel like they don't have privilege to get them to understand the injustice of that, the injustice of someone not having an advantage, being part of another group. And if you are talking to white people who feel guilty, this is the best advice, to remind them that they didn't ask for the skin privilege and they can't give it away. There's literally nothing they can do about it. It has nothing to do with them individually. So there's no value in feeling guilty. And guilt is one of the things that gets in the way of people actually making change. So we don't want to make white people or wealthy people or male people or straight people or Christian people or English-speaking people or US citizens or able-bodied people. We don't want them, or cisgendered people. We don't want them feeling guilty. That's useless. We need them to understand the injustice and to participate in correcting that. If you're born white, you're able to discount the experiences of people of color because they're not your experiences. So we see this most recently as the example of talking back to Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter. I forgot my R there. And so from the perspective of the people who want to emphasize that all lives matter, we understand that at the heart that's true, but it seems like there's a mistake that in assuming that the people who are in the movement for Black Lives Matter, the false assumption is that they're saying that only Black Lives Matter. There's no only in front of that. So the movement is to call attention to the historical marginalization of Black people and the real effect that that's had. So discrimination, denial of housing and access to healthcare, to education, to financial resources, but also the disparate treatment in the criminal justice system, sometimes resulting in death. And there's just too many examples to go into and too many examples for anyone to be ignorant of it. We can't indulge in ignorance about this phenomenon. It is a phenomenon. So the Black Lives Matter movement is about calling attention to that. But if you're white, one of your options is to say, oh, I don't believe that, or that I don't see it that way, or in my experience, it hasn't been that way. That's your experience, and your experience is valid for yourself, but it defies every statistical measure that we have about the social phenomenon in the US. Also, if you're born white, you have the option to believe that race is not your issue, that you don't want to get into racial politics. Oh, that's either there's too much about that, or that's not important, that doesn't have anything to do with me. And you can live the rest of your life and feel that way. People who aren't white don't have that option. It's a life or death situation for them, so they have to be involved and informed about racial issues. So we're setting up white privilege as being a phenomenon, a concept, an idea within multicultural education, so that when people hear about efforts toward social justice based on race, they understand this concept of privilege, right? This unearned institutional privilege. It's not an individual thing. And white privilege also doesn't mean that all white people are racist. It doesn't have anything to do with anyone's individual actions. It's it's just a social advantage of birth, one among many. So going back to the history of multicultural education in the United States, we have the father of multicultural education, James Banks, and I wanted to feature his partner and wife, Sherry Banks, and they both together co-edited the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education. And you get the Banks chapter, and you get Gloria Ladson-Billings chapter, and lots of other great stuff in that handbook. It's about that thick, really heavy, very expensive. You can check that out at the library if you're interested in more of the chapters from that book. The first edition was 1995, but it's been updated. I think the last was 2013. There might be another one more recent though. You can hyperlink to check out the bios of these two here, but what I'm focusing on here are James Banks' 5 dimensions of multicultural education. So he wants to get into how multicultural education operates in the school. So here are his 5 dimensions, and you can hyperlink if you've downloaded the slides to find out a little bit more, but I think all you need is contained in that first chapter, the Banks chapter. So if you read that, you'll get the gist of what he has to say about these dimensions. Content integration, the knowledge construction process, prejudice reduction, an equity pedagogy, and an empowering school culture and social structure. So we'll take a look at them individually. If you put together Banks's definition of multicultural education, he says it's a field of study and a pedagogy, a way of educating people, and an educational practice whose major aim is to create equal educational opportunities for students from diverse racial, ethnic, social class, and cultural groups, including religious groups and LGBT students. So this is the mission. Equal educational opportunities. Notice the first mission isn't a broader awareness of the complexities and completeness of human history, which it could be, but the purpose here is to create equal educational opportunities, to give male and female students an equal chance to educational success and mobility, to help all students to acquire the knowledge, attitudes, and skills needed to function effectively in a pluralistic, democratic society and interact with people from diverse groups. So again, pulling away from that idea of ethnic studies or cultural studies, if by that we mean just a collection of studies of different groups of people. But here this aim is equal educational opportunity, and for the purpose of living in a pluralistic, democratic society. Pluralistic means that there are different groups of people not all of whom will always mesh together, some of whom will always have opposing positions, but because of their status as citizens of the United States, their views have to be taken into consideration, and we have to work toward compromise when we don't agree. And so pluralistic is a way to refer to diverse societies when we recognize that there's not always going to be 100% consensus. That's okay. It's actually necessary for democracy. So the first part, the first dimension that Banks sees, and the easiest thing for teachers to do, is content integration. So content integration is just literally using examples from a variety of cultures and groups to illustrate key concepts. So here we have the additive approach of multicultural education. Like I said, most core history books are going to be telling the history of the first immigrants from Great Britain and their story as they create out of the previous English colonies a new country in North America. But there's so many more stories, not least of which is the story about the people, the widely diverse groups of people who were in North America before the first wave of English immigrants came. So here's some examples. Starting from the bottom, these are guys. These are dancers in New York, and they're referred to collectively as ballerinos. And the idea is to highlight the intersection of gender and biological sex, and this concept of dancing as being something that is assigned to women, right? So we've long had the term ballerina, and now we might recognize male dancers as ballerinos. So that's it. That's a pretty good item of interest. I would say high interest for kids. That's a provocative name and interesting. For people who are involved in teaching physical education, this could be an item to explore. Here you see a stay-at-home dad taking care of his young child. So something maybe to be discussed in social studies, economics, home economics, psychology, childcare, career exploration, things like that. You've got GM's CEO, who happens to be a woman. So if you're talking about, again, social studies and industry, business, CEO, administration, leadership, or anything to do with mechanics, the car industry, unions, anything like that, why not feature a story of GM CEO, or tell the story of GM through by including the story of their CEO. Of course, you have a doctor up there, and so what's funny when you look for images of doctors, you see a lot of white men and women, you see black men and women, but I don't know if it's your experience. I think it's a pretty common experience across the country now, is that we have a lot of former immigrants who are doctors who work in the healthcare field. So it's very likely that you'll see an Indian or Pakistani doctor. So to the left, you see the cats of the world. So cats are my favorite animals. This could be world cultures. This could be learning languages. This could be just something fun for young kids. as a gateway into questioning about different cultures and different languages. So this is another part of content integration. Oops, let me go back for a minute. I have links to the NEA and Colerain, Colorado. These are sources of curriculum materials if you want to add multicultural elements to your teaching for literature. I think literature is probably the most obvious place where we find the integration of multicultural resources. But I wanted to give you examples of math, physical education, and science here. So Marilyn Frankenstein, that's how she pronounces it, if she's still alive, was an educator in New York who used critical mathematics to teach people mathematics, kids of all ages, while at the same time raising awareness of inequalities. So an example of critical mathematics is to use mathematics to study a problem of inequality, so the poverty rate among racial and ethnic groups. Teaching someone how to manage personal finances could be something easily thought of as critical mathematics, right? Teaching someone how the stock market works, teaching someone how to prepare for a career in finance, which has been dominated by white men, right? So we can find a way to infuse any curriculum with a little bit of multicultural content, drawing from whatever group that we want to, or using the critical approach. So when we use a critical approach to any of our subjects, and we ask why not all groups have been included, that's also multicultural education. Special Olympics, gender equity in sports, games from around the world. These can be a way to, let me pause here for a minute. Oops. Let me escape to, okay, I had to pause that. My husband was having a conversation with his mother in the living room and it was being picked up. The knowledge construction process. So we're still on James Banks' 5 dimensions of multicultural education. And content integration, if you start there, that's a great place to go, but don't end there. Don't stop there, because then you are just adding a few elements to your content without actually achieving those goals of equality of educational opportunity, gender equity, and preparation for living in a pluralistic democratic society. So there are 4 levels to the knowledge construction process. So this has to do with the way that people think of the curriculum being composed and what knowledge is of most use and what's important to know. So just like the content integration, the contributions approach is going to add things to the curriculum as it is. So we call this kind of multicultural education Heroes, Holidays, Food and Music, or Food, Fun, and Faces. So this is the kind of multicultural education approach where you have a multicultural education fair or a multicultural education day, or in this country we do months dedicated to groups. that's good. That's a good place to start. But again, that's a long way from the vision of a equal opportunity education system or preparation for living in an equitable, pluralistic society. So I see the celebration of months as being complicated, right? It's an opportunity for us to focus more deeply on one group, perhaps, but it's not an excuse to only focus on the members of that group or the histories of that group or the struggles of that group during that 1 month. The additive approach is, again, taking the content as it is, the curriculum, and adding one unit. So we'll do 1 unit on women or 1 unit on Native Americans. It's good, right? It's a way to start getting your kids to recognize that the story of history is just the story of a narrow group of people. And that's important, right? Because once they know that, then they'll be able to ask questions on their own, like who else was there, or what did this group of people think about that, or what was the perspective of this group. Now when we get into levels 3 and 4, we're actually transforming the curriculum. So the structure of the curriculum has changed. The focus goes away from that history of that one select group of people. The focus shifts away from the dominant culture to a plurality of cultures. And people fear that there's this core bit of knowledge that originates from the dominant culture that I call the first wave of English immigrants to North America. There's this fear that if we don't learn all of that, then we won't be educated. But you see, we're already missing out on the full history and a full education of humanity. So we can balance that out by shifting our perspectives and learning different content. Here, multicultural content, text, activities are going to be used in every class. So it's going to be infused across the curriculum. It's not going to be seen as an extra. We're not going to be talking about the history of whatever discipline, the history of science, the history of politics, we're not going to be talking about just the partial history or just the history of a certain group of people and then adding in, right? We're going to be talking about history as told from different perspectives. A good text on this is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I think he takes a good transformative approach. And then the social action approach is less about the curriculum and more about the school activities. So raising critical issues within the school that the kids can participate in. Service learning projects are, I guess, our best example. As long as they are not just a checkbox for graduation, as long as they are something that is truly meaningful to the students, it should be something that they tell you bothers them about their own community. That's a good place to start for service learning projects. So the next dimension of Banks multicultural education is the equity pedagogy. And here we start hearing this term culturally responsive pedagogy. And we have Gloria Ladson-Billings, who explicates this term a little bit better. But this is a way of teaching. It's not the curriculum, it's not the content, but it's a different way of teaching that helps to facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse cultural groups. So this requires a little bit of knowledge of your particular students, what their experiences are, what their prior knowledge is, what their deficiencies are, what they care about, what the values are of their home culture, and what's important to them, and how are some of the ways that they've been excluded from school, or why are they developing negative attitudes about school, or what is the school experience like for them. So that's all involved in shifting your way of teaching. And it really does have a lot to do with knowing your students. Using multiple teaching styles, allowing students to work in groups or individually, allowing students to have movement and to use construction to communicate that they've learned a certain skill through a discipline that is of high interest to them or to their community. Attending to group preferences in learning and demonstrating learning, allowing people to do performances or poetry, allowing kids to teach you about the ways that they communicate in their home communities. So there is I'm blanking on the author's name right now of Hip Hop Pedagogy, but it is a book for white teachers who are teaching in the hood. And I'll remember that and post that on our Western Online space. Hip Hop Pedagogy. And the point here is that we've got an imbalance in we've got a cultural divide. We've got more children of color in the public schools and more white teachers, white female teachers in the teaching force. So a lot of times we have teachers teaching kids when they don't know anything about their home lives or their cultures. So I think so no. I'm not going to say his name because I'm just guessing at this point, but he tells the story himself of being a young teacher in New York, and even though he's African American, he didn't share the home lives of the kids in the city that he was teaching, so he didn't have access to their cultural experiences too. But he got to know them, and he helped to teach them using language practices and activities that they were interested in. And so he's writing this to teachers, saying that they can do this too. And it's not about acting Black or acting Chicano or acting like your students. It's not that, but it's recognizing that they have engagement practices that might work better for them in learning, and taking the time to understand what those might be. Prejudice reduction. So here is where we have to acknowledge white privilege and hetero privilege and male privilege, right? So it's anti-racist pedagogy. It's not enough, Banks is saying, for complete multicultural education just to recognize and celebrate diversity, but we have to work against racism too. We have to work against sexism, ableism. We have to work against bigotry. And so this is an anti-prejudice or prejudice reduction position to take. So one of the films that I use in my undergraduate teaching is called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And it's dated by now, but it's really good on telling the history of the construction of the idea of race, because there is no such thing as a biological race. And so that fact right there causes a lot of people to dismiss discussions of race. They say, well, if there is no such thing as race, then what are you talking about? You're just making a lot out of nothing. But it is a sociological phenomenon that has sometimes severe repercussions. And it was a term constructed, race was an idea constructed to justify the subjugation of African Americans as slaves. And then later other immigrants. So it was a way, it was a construction of the first wave English immigrants in this country. It happened in other countries too. But in the US, it was a construction of those. We sometimes call them the founding fathers in order to legitimize and defend the practice of slavery. And then prejudice of all kind and the restriction of citizenship of all kind, rights and power. Another activity useful in college classrooms, but could happen also in middle and high schools, asking students to uncover their own prejudices and bias through journals. This could be two-way journals to keep students' ideas private if that's something that they don't want to talk about. But I think that we would be surprised with how much our kids are aware of now. That I don't think that they would be very surprised in talking about or recognizing that people belong to different social groups. I think it's a part of social studies that we need to acknowledge. Explain institutional racism as opposed to racist beliefs. So make sure kids aren't understanding racism as just individual acts of meanness, but that they understand what that means systematically, what they understand, what privilege means systematically, and again, that they develop a complicated understanding of it that doesn't have anything to do with individuals. That's hard for people, so that might be a college level conversation. Introducing the concept of white privilege. I think this is definitely happening in high schools, if not middle schools. These are things that have repercussions for people of color, no matter what their age are, and teen boys are or at danger of having negative encounters with the criminal justice system. So these are conversations that could be life-saving. Teach racial identity development theory. I use Beverly Tatum. Some people use, don't know his last name, or his first, I can't remember his first name. Howard is his last name, and he talks about white racial identity development. Tatum talks about Black racial identity development. This is a topic in psychology, mostly for college students, certainly for teacher education. Introduce white students to successful white allies, people like Tim Wise, who have a positive racial identity as someone who fights against the phenomenon of systemic racism as a white person. So remember I said there's either resistance to the idea of racism from white people or guilt. And here you have the opportunity to show successful, prominent white allies who struggled to adopt that identity. And then connect for them the structures of oppression, intersectionality, that idea that your membership in one status category is going to complicate the kinds of privileges that you have in another. And a good resource for this is Heather Hackman. And then an empowering school culture. So this has to do with the different groups that you recognize in schools, with the hiring practices of the school, the school events that we choose to highlight. Does it always have to be football? Is football always the premier student group that we promote? Service projects, right? What is the school known for? How does the school interact with the community? How do they communicate what's important to them? So sticking with the book, James Banks' book, I think the second chapter or the third chapter is from Gloria Ladson Billings. And so she's talking to you here about the different kinds of multicultural education, from conservative to liberal to left liberal to critical. And critical is where we're going to focus, because in higher ed, that's where we aim, that's where we intersect with multicultural education. This is inclusive of multiple cultures, of class, of gender, sexual orientation, ability, language. And so critical multicultural education involves critical race theory. Critical race theory comes from the African American experience. It's an intersection with law, theories of law and practices of law argumentation. And then Lat Crit is that application of critical race theory from the perspective of Latinx individuals. Here's a little bit more on culturally responsive pedagogy, and that's Gloria Ladson Billings. What she's doing now, I was surprised to learn that she's 73. She certainly still looks vibrant, and still speaks on culturally responsive pedagogy. So back in 1995, I think we first get this term from her, and it's the importance of including students' cultural references. So as I explained, as part of multicultural education, this is the teaching part. Part of this teaching approach is to lead students through a process of identity exploration and transformation, help to connect students to their communities in empowering ways. And so you can hyperlink to Gloria Ladson Billings and more of what she does and what she's written about. It's much more complex than the overview that I'm giving you, just to understand the connection to multicultural education. So critical race theory is I guess the foundation of culturally responsive pedagogy, or one of the theoretical tools of culturally responsive pedagogy. What's different about critical race theory is that it assumes that racism or oppression of any kind is normal in US society. It's not an aberration. It doesn't have to do with any individual bad actors. This is our history. This has been the way that the country was constructed from the beginning, from the first wave of immigrants from Great Britain to the genocide of the Native Americans, the theft of land on which the new country was built, and then the racial hierarchy, certainly the male hierarchy with regard to women. So this is who we are. This was our history, and then it's paired with our ideals of being a diverse, pluralistic democracy. So if that's the case, we've got work to do. And so this is why we keep struggling, we keep talking about this, is because our history does not match our ideals, or the ideals we espouse anyway, espouse. So this capitalizes on interest convergence with dominant groups. So where is it in the interest of the affluent to create policies that will help racial minority groups? Where is it in the interest of white people? Where is it in the interest of native English speakers to help immigrants? Where is it in the interest of Christian folks to help religious minority groups, right? So you can expand from race, but where do we have convergent interests? Let's work on that. Much less time is wasted on complaining about positions or beliefs of the dominant group. It's all about action and strategy. So applied to education, the idea that the recognition that the historical curriculum is just partial and was designed to maintain the status quo, that poor and minority students receive a pedagogy of poverty. So we saw this from Anyon studies, that we understand that kids from different class backgrounds get a different, not just quality of education, but a kind of education, meaning they're told to prepare for a future that too often reflects their present situation. The idea that standardized testing harms poor students and harms students of color, that this is a marginalizing practice. It reinforces the belief in inferiority, when really what it's really correlated most strongly with is the parents' affluence. That's what's reproduced in any standardized test that we see. We see revealing differences in class. We do not see this as being a useful measure of what students know. There's a supplemental on contemplative race theory. So I'm very interested in the intersection of contemplative studies and critical studies, and here's one intersection. This is a bonus for you. I'm going to take another break. Okay, back again. All right. So I wanted to connect critical race theory for you to some of the bonus material that I have in this module. So one of the applications of critical race theory and its component, teaching pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy, is to use the history of students' home cultures to help them to develop a positive academic identity. So in the case of Tucson Unified School District and other school districts where there's a high population of Chicano students, and Chicano is an ethnic identity of Mexican Americans, the educators decided that they had a problem with the Chicano students not feeling connected to school, feeling like they weren't welcome in school, they weren't doing well. So they got together to completely rethink their teaching approach, and they came up with a Mexican American Studies curriculum. And this curriculum would use in literature and history, reaching back into the culture of the early Native Mexican cultures and their richness, their access to philosophy and astronomy, mathematics, and their political system, agricultural system, and the diversity that was part of Mexico, and these Mexican civilizations, pre-Columbian Mexican civilizations. So one of the ideas of infusing the philosophy of this ancient Mexican, pan-Mexican cultural identity is taken from a poem by Luis Valdez. And we call it In Lak'ech, in the circle. So it's in both Spanish and English, and this is what the kids would recite. So it gives you a flavor of the entire curriculum. There is that idea that we are all connected through our basic humanity. And so whatever I do to myself, I'm also doing to you, and whatever I do to you, I'm also doing to myself. So it's a beautiful philosophy of um, shared humanity and mutual reciprocity. So this is what the students and the teachers would say. And you can read more about the particular curriculum and pedagogical approach in Aberrio Pedagogy. That's not required, that's bonus. The story about Tucson Unified School District was captured in the documentary film Precious Knowledge. And if you have taken any of the ESL courses, you may have come across this film. I know it's an important part of the curriculum for the ESL or TESOL endorsement sequence. So part of the curriculum included the teachings of Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator. So we encountered Freire already when we were talking about a critical approach. So the Freire's different levels of consciousness are taught to students so that they can understand a little bit about the way that that they are operating as students in school, and what perspectives they might adopt without any kind of intervention. So magical thinking, students might blame inequality on luck, fate, or God. And so when that's the case, students resign themselves. There's nothing they can do. It's out of their control. They might develop a naive thinking or naive consciousness. So they might blame themselves or their culture. We Chicanos are just stupid, or we're just good for labor. And so this is sometimes called internalized oppression, where they adopt the values and the perspectives of the dominant culture about themselves to their own detriment. But what this pedagogy is working toward is a critical consciousness, a critical perspective. So students look beyond fatalistic and cultural reasons for inequality and look at the structural and systemic explorations. And learning about their own history helps them to do this. Learning about their incorporation into the United States when the border shifted, right? Some of their families have been in this country, in this land, longer from before the first wave of English immigrants came. It's just when the borders shifted, so that they shifted south, so that the people of Mexico became American citizens, or wasn't that simple, but became part of the U.S. At that time. So again, culturally responsive pedagogy is a critical pedagogy. Students are asking questions about why things are the way that they are. And this can be applied to other groups too. And so I'm suggesting here that this can be applied to the history, the incorporation or exclusion of queer folks, LGBT folks too. And here's a little activist. This gives you the history, if you're interested in it, of the state of Arizona's move to ban the Mexican American Studies curriculum. They accused it itself, accused the program of being racist, accused it of preaching un-American ideas. And if you see the the curriculum, what the kids were learning, and just as embodied in their philosophy in Lakesh, you can understand that that's not true. That's not the approach that they're taking. All in all, the struggle was considered a success because the federal district ruling in Arizona saw the move to ban the program as racist and unconstitutional. By then, the program had changed very much, and the educators had moved on. But their struggle was involved the community, students, parents, teachers, and then they received national coverage too, and reached out to educators across the country and said, "Here's our curriculum. We're not allowed to teach it. Will you please teach that?" And I remember being involved in that and presenting the curriculum to my own students. So I think we're coming close to the end of the topics that you had to read in this module, and it becomes too much sometimes when you're involved in social justice work to uncover the injustices, to map the scope of injustice. So that's not sustaining, and that is not the way to change policy. That's not the way to make anything better. So we need to adopt policies that are adjusting for these situations. So one of the suggestions for schools to interrupt the school to prison pipeline, and if you're not familiar with what that is, that minority students, African American and Chicano boys in particular, are disproportionately involved in the juvenile justice system, which exponentially increases their chances of being incarcerated as adults. And the moves that push or pull these kids into the criminal justice system have been analyzed, and we see that a overly punitive discipline system in schools is the start of the school to prison pipeline. So what can we do about that? That's already been studied to death, right? It's happening. It functions pretty well. So what can we do to interrupt that? Well, changing the disciplinary structure to something that is going to serve the effect of changing negative and harmful behaviors in school and preventing them, while at the same time keeping kids in school and keeping them out of the criminal justice system. So restorative justice is the best studied and most efficacious program, systematic program that we have. You can watch the video about Chicago Public Schools that explains the school to prison pipeline and also the way that restorative justice programs are done. Basically, what you're doing is teaching kids, teens, how to manage problems on their own. So you train kids on how to be peer mediators and peer jurors. So when there's a conflict, the parties are asked to meet and discuss that and talk about ways to make up for any harms that were caused and how to reintegrate the offender back into the community. So you can both read the report here on implementing restorative justice and watch the video. So from the report, I just wanted to call your attention to this chart that compares punitive disciplinary actions with restorative ones. So for an example of conflict or wrongdoing is represented as impersonal and abstract, individual versus school. A restorative point of view says that conflict or wrongdoing is recognized as interpersonal conflicts with opportunity for learning. So it's a social integration model. It's an idea that that steers away from associating bad actions with bad actors individually. It looks at the whole community and asks what's going on and how can we correct the behavior in a way that keeps this community member as part of the community. So finally, we have two authors who are writing at the intersection of, in this case, critical multicultural education and mindfulness. So I want to call your attention to the work of Rhonda Magee, and she is a JD. She's a professor of law at the University of San Francisco, and she's the chair at the board that's at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And that's where I first encountered her at a conference. Her latest book is called The Inner Work of Racial Justice. So she has long talked about the ability of mindfulness practices to help us to uncover our implicit biases. Remember, I said these are things that we're born with, and then they're enhanced through socialization to prime us to have our specific prejudices and beliefs about groups of people. Mindfulness has been shown to help people to realize those biases and the flaws of those predetermined beliefs about whole groups of people. So Rhonda Magee is one of those people that is leading reform efforts within organizations that see that they have a problem with racial bias or some other kind of bias. And they want to do something about it. So she starts them off with basic courses in mindfulness and uses mindfulness techniques to facilitate discussions about bias and how we can change our bias and counteract the actions that result from bias. And then Beth Barilla, someone you encountered already in the last module, the module about feminists. And so Beth Barilla is writing about the intersection between mindfulness and diversity courses. So a course like this, in working with students in a classroom who have been asked to investigate their internal biases or the effects of discrimination on them. Mindfulness can help students learn how their social identity shapes their reactions to course content, their willingness to engage with discussions of oppression. And she says that this is helpful in unlearning the effects of system of oppression. So, these two women and more are working at this very interesting field of intersection. All right, so that's finally it. Pardon the interruptions, all part of working at home and where other people are engaged in their own activities as well as you are. I know you know what I'm talking about. Thank you.